NDE 1. When I was in my early 20s, I had something resembling a cancer scare. I had precancerous cells on the cervix of my uterus, and I required a procedure called a cone biopsy. This is typically not a dangerous procedure, but afterwards, one must take care to avoid interfering with the surgery site. No baths, no sex, and no heavy lifting. The prohibition I had difficulty sticking to was the no heavy lifting. I had a toddler. We heated the house by wood. 7 days after the surgery, I was hitching the baby on one hip and loading the wood on the other. I went to bed that night and awakened in a small pool of blood. When I stood, the flood of red grew. I held sanitary pads to myself, but they were spent in a very short time. I held baby diapers, then towels, and then glasses from the cupboard to myself, to catch the flow. I realized I was bleeding to death. I called the ambulance, set out a flashing light on the rural road, and awakened a neighbor to watch my child. The emergency folk arrived, took my story, and we set out for the 1-hour drive to the hospital. On the way, I lost about half my blood before losing consciousness. Dying or dead? I don't know. All I know is I went from being terribly, bone-deep, chatteringly cold and bleeding in an ambulance, to the brightest and warmest place imaginable. These are not facile descriptors. The light was like an explosion of golden yellow, accompanied by the most exquisite warmth. It is not enough to say it enveloped me. It was me, a mellow sun, a languorous day, a paradise of contentment. All was one. It was the most sublime pleasure I have ever felt. I basked in this place, even as I thought I am dying. I thought of my death at the same time as I thought of my life. But I was not thinking. Everything was happening at the same time, the sensuous basking in this beautiful light, my death, my life. I was afraid for my daughter. When the emergency medical technician waved an ammonia ampoule under my nose, I came back to the ambulance, and I gave them the phone number for my parents. We arrived at the hospital, they repaired the erupted cervical artery, and took me off the oxygen. My blood was drawn and tested. My blood values were low, so they gave me 2 units of packed cells via a blood transfusion. I think of this as the time I almost died, or the time I decided not to die. I am fascinated by the near-death experiences of others. The random firings of an underperfused brain or heaven? Tales of the light, the tunnel, and the beckoning figures. And even as I vote in favor of the lack of oxygenated blood to the brain versus heaven, I wonder. What benevolent thing makes our last minutes like this, welcoming, light, warm, and full of joy? NDE 2. I was in a car accident in August of 1990. My boyfriend at the time was driving and I was in the front passenger seat. We came round a corner, he wasn't looking ahead, and we crashed into a car that had stopped to turn right. My face smashed into the dashboard and the windscreen came in on me. My seat came unwelded from the floor and my head smashed into the roof of the vehicle. I also had quite a deep injury to my leg. The next thing, I was screaming and being dragged out of the car by my boyfriend and neighbors that had come out of their houses. I then passed out on the ground, which was when I had my strange experience. I felt as though I was looking down on myself for a brief moment, and then there was a real feeling of peace and calm. I was no longer scared or in pain. I remember I was in a very beautiful and vast place, with stunning landscapes of trees, lakes and waterfalls, and everything was blue. There were people around me. I am not sure how many, as I didn't really see them. I could just feel their presence and the feeling of love. They knew my name and they reassured me that everything was going to be all right, particularly one man who I believe could have been my grandfather. He died before I was born, so I did not know what he looked like. The next thing I know, I had come round and was back to reality. I felt a huge sense of sadness and longed to go back. NDE 3. I drank liquid paraffin in an attempted suicide at about 2 or 3 in the morning. I then went back to bed. Simple, or so I thought. Sometime later, after waking and throwing up, I cleaned myself up. I was in the greatest physical pain I have ever known, so I called 911. I have the memory of being taken to hospital. I was telling the doctor the ambulance drivers were rude, which was an understatement. I remember him answering that it was more important to get me okay than to take care of rude ambulance drivers. I told him I drank liquid paraffin, asked him for a painkiller, and passed out. Apparently, I was taken to the hospital immediately. I was cyanotic, blue, no air. I don't know if I was clinically dead or not. But what I do know is that I was in a coma for 3 weeks. During these 3 weeks, I lived another full life. In that time, I saw that my father was to choose which of 3 personalities he wished to raise. He had essentially 3 versions of me to choose: 1, beautiful and stupid, or 2, irrecoverably damaged, or 3, me as I exist today, the fixable one. Number 3 was his choice for this altered reality. I was observing the choosing part in the third person. For the rest of the experience, it became a first-person experience. I was 14 again, briefly, talk about scary. Somehow, I got to experience love at first sight and have it returned. I met my husband, Kieran, and we got married in my altered state. He was my cousin, the third son of the second cousin of my mother, enough to make an anthropologist say it was okay. He was much younger than me, and he was 5 feet 11 inches tall. He came from a Lake Erie family of Scottish origin. Their renowned family business of ship and boat builders had been in existence for at least 3 generations. All the vessels they built were made of wood, even after the advent of fiberglass. The family was well known for their wooden artwork, and as such, were also asked to sculpt a large commemoration for a somebody. My husband had taken over the family business when his father and 2 older brothers had gone to war. My husband's father and brothers were on submarine duty together. For years they were lost, then were found. All were okay, but I wouldn't swear to their mental health. The family politics were not good. There was not another happy person to be found, anywhere. My family chose to leave. His father was one of the most obnoxious people I have ever met. His mother was a sophisticated cretin. One and all hated me. I really couldn't understand the depth of the feeling, and I still don't. Also, there was an accident and my husband lost his right arm during the building of a new ship. This was some time before I met him. I can't envision him not being whole, despite that he insists on it being the truth. When I remember lying in bed with him, there is not a problem with one side or the other. But, obviously there should have been. My wedding was beautiful, even if it was somewhat rushed. I was not pregnant. Although I recall, we made love and planned to get caught, so that the family would agree to our wedding. The sisters and brothers and the rest of his family were there. My ring was his mother's wedding ring. He asked me if his mother's ring was acceptable. I knew it meant so much to him, so of course, I said, yes. We had calla lilies and white roses everywhere. Despite the family animosity, we loved each other and they respected him enough to give us the wedding of anyone's dreams. The bridesmaid dresses were the best I have ever seen, they were not off the rack. They were the salmon pink of ladies' underthings in the 30s with 3/4 sleeves, longish ballerina skirts, jewel collar in front, a deep V ending in a very lazy southern bow with short tails. My dress was much the same, but I was a widow before marrying Kieran. I am a widow in this life also, and the color was cream. I'd like to say he wore an afternoon, dove-colored tux, as that would have been more in keeping with the times. But, it was a very deep gray, or perhaps even black. Either way, I've never seen a man look more wonderful. The most important thing was the feel of his lips right after the ceremony. Loving and hungry, and full of promise. I knew what to expect, but I never ever suspected a man to convey the hope and trust and eagerness of the present and the future in a breath, in a small moment of time. It was all there, he and I, whatever would be. I have to say that I have never loved, nor given or been loved in that way. I cannot forget, nor would I wish to. In this plane, I know of no such person. In fact, I'm widowed 15 years this year 2002, and a second marriage is not on my to-do list. No criticism regarding the institution itself. After I returned to this state, I went through a quite normal grieving process at having to leave Kieran behind. I still have a sensation that it wouldn't be unusual at all, to turn a street corner and there he'd be. Now that I am here, in this reality, sometimes he is so extremely present, that I have to turn around to make sure it's here and not there. Considering world events, it feels like I've entered a third reality sometimes. During the first 3 months after my experience, I had to make up my mind which reality was the real place. The temptation to return was nearly overwhelming, at first. That is not the end of my journey, but what woman in her right mind wouldn't want a love such as that? There have been times when the desire is so strong in this life, I think my heart will break. NDE 4. I was floating upward. I was thinking how I wasn't having any pain. My neck and shoulders had been in a spasm for about 2 days. It was the first time in 5 years that I could feel warmth. The light was so bright and warm, it had a yellow hue about it. I told people that if the light was that bright it would blind you. It was bright, but warm and calming at the same time. I could hear voices, none were familiar to me. At first, I didn't understand, but it became clear. It wasn't time for me. I wanted to stay. I was at peace.